Esther's in the Old Testament. Esther's in the Old Testament.
I know that. Probably.
Probably.
All right, Esther chapter 1, verses 10 through 12. When you find your place, please stand. Esther 1, 10 through 12. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagatha, Zethar and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti, the queen, before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Lord, thank you for this opportunity to preach today. I pray you bless me and let me speak those words which will benefit you. Be with us all, Jesus. Amen. Historically speaking, Esther is one of the latter back books of the Old Testament. It takes place while the Israelites are held captive in Persia, which chronologically places it after all the books of Kings and Samuel and Daniel, as the Persian Empire rose to power after the Babylonian one. In Persian society, like with many countries then and now, the ruler of the kingdom was pretty much absolute. I do not believe he was actively worshipped as a god like in Egypt, where the pharaoh was considered to become a god when he died, but the king was pretty much the basin of human power in that area. The power was not absolute. I believe the book of Daniel tells us that even the king of Persia could not change a law once that law was put into service. He could not go back on his decree that anyone who wouldn't worship him was thrown into the lion's den, for example, so he couldn't save his friend Daniel. However, the king was a mighty and respected man. That does not mean that they always treated themselves with respect, if that makes any sense. As we find here that basically the king of the most powerful empire on earth at the time, or at least in this area, is wasting all of that money and power and success on just throwing a big party and getting drunk. Very relatable, but not a great skill for a leader of a kingdom to be indulging in. And this brings us to the character of Queen Vashti. King, what was his name? King what's his face? Ahasuerus. There it is. King Ahasuerus' first wife. We don't know a lot about her, but she is, in my mind at least, defined by being a brave or perhaps just stubborn woman. In a kingdom like Persia, it is not generally considered a good idea to deny the king anything, no matter if you even are his own wife. So her telling him flat point, I do not want to come to your party, is a pretty bold move. It may be just personal pride, or she may have more moral standards than her husband did. Regardless of the reason, she says no. King Ahasuerus consults with his wise men, and they decide that they need to set an example of the queen and throw her out, banish her, basically, for disobeying her husband's command. This, of course, leaves the king without a wife, which is never a good condition for a king. Monarchies are hereditary, and if you don't have a wife, you can't have kids, and your kingdom is going to end with you, which is not something many rulers of the time desired. So, King Ahasuerus calls for a countrywide search for a new wife. All the beautiful young women are brought together, so he can pick the best among them, or perhaps just the prettiest, and declare her to be his new wife. If we move to Esther chapter 2, verses 12. Now when every maid's turn was come to go into King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purifications accomplished, to wit 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. Then thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women to the custody of Shazagaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and then she was called by name. Verses 15. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go unto the king, she required nothing but what Haggai the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther there obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house, royal in the 10th month, which is the month Timnith, in the 7th year of his reign. Yada yada yada. Verse 17. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Thus enters Queen Esther, a humble young Hebrew woman, selected for this process simply because she's young and pretty looking, raised by her uncle Mordecai. Apparently a very humble and likable person, as it says here that she won the favor of everyone she worked with and did not require anything beyond what the officials already gave her. And perhaps it's because of her spirit more than her physical beauty that she is chosen to succeed Vashti as the queen. All in all, this has to be a really good deal. Being a Hebrew, she is not technically Persian. She's a captive in their country for all intents and purposes. So this would be a very surprising place for her to find herself. I doubt there was very many people in that land who would ever expect a Hebrew to become queen. And indeed, it appears that no one still expected it, even after it happened, as her ethnicity was not widely known. Haman, the second in command of the kingdom and advisor to the king himself, was apparently unaware of where exactly Esther came from. If he had known, he perhaps would have been a little smarter about his scheming for power. Well, let's back up. Haman was, for all intents and purposes, the Daniel of sorts to King Ahasuerus, though obviously a lot less morally principled than the actual prophet of Daniel. He was his advisor, his wise man, his number one guy, second in command, pretty much the most powerful person you could get without being the king himself. The problem is, with power sometimes comes pettiness, and this was definitely the case with Haman. If he had been content with his power, his status in the kingdom, ruling over pretty much everyone loves you, gosh, what a guy, bows when you pass, he probably would have lived a long and happy life. Unfortunately, there was a lowly Hebrew official by the name of Mordecai who refused to bow to him. Despite his power and influence in the country, Mordecai was of the belief that you didn't bow to anyone but God and your king. And since Haman was neither of them, he did not bow. And this did not sit well with Haman. Now, your standard corrupt politician or person in power would most likely just have Mordecai and maybe his family killed in the night. Haman was an overachiever who decided he wanted to commit genocide on Mordecai's entire people. I must question this man's decisions in many different ways. So, as we continue, Mordecai refuses to pay respect and honor to Haman. Haman plots to destroy the Israelites. Mordecai discovers this plot and basically lets his niece or surrogate daughter in on that plan, and they begin scheming together, kind of, to save the Israelites. However, their schemes are very different than Haman's, whereas Haman's is plotting genocide because of over a petty disrespect and building gallows in his own backyard to personally murder Haman. Mordecai and Esther are basically debating how they're going to save their family. If we turn to chapter 4, verses, let's see, 13 through to 17. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, "Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews." To set up this scene, Mordecai has contacted Esther and said, "Hey, please go tell your husband not to kill all the Jews because that would be a bummer." Esther has sent the message back that Israelites are no one actually is allowed to go before the king without a direct invitation. So she can't even ask the king anything because she's not allowed into the throne room unless he sends for her. That must make marriage very awkward. So Mordecai basically sends back, "Hey, if this is because you think you can escape by being in the palace, don't even try it. Someone is going to find out you're a Jew and take advantage of it. Maybe someone who lost out the title of queen, who decides if you're out of the way, you can be her successor." Verse 14, "For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to this kingdom for such a time as this?" Probably the most famous line from this entire book. Mordecai was a man of faith, as many good Israelites were in this time. He believed his people would be protected from this slaughter no matter what. He did not believe that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and all his other forefathers would allow this great slaughter to take place. So he reassures Esther that our people are going to be safe regardless of what happens. But you could miss out on a very important opportunity. Not only could you die, but you could lose the privilege of being God's instrument for our salvation. And I strongly suggest that the miraculous thing of a young Hebrew woman becoming queen of Persia, that's probably so you can save us. It's basically a plea from him to his daughter, where it says Mordecai raised Esther, to not pass up God's will or opportunity for her. Verses 15, "Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shunai, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish." I think we are all aware that the book of Esther is the one book in the Bible that does not mention God even once. Not his name, nor even making a direct reference to him. However, I think it's very clear that his presence is felt through all this book. Esther's instructions for Mordecai is not along the lines of what someone like Haman would suggest. It's not, let's gather all of us together, defend ourselves through our own powers, let's grab weapons, let's try to overthrow the kingdom. It's nothing like that. It's the only help she asks for, the only thing she requires of anyone in this case is prayer and fasting. She's not looking to herself or Mordecai or even her husband really for help here. All she wants is to appeal to God, because there's really no one else they would be praying or fasting for in this setting, for help. And even then she acknowledges that maybe Mordecai is wrong. Maybe she's not the chosen instrument of Israel's deliverance, but she's mostly okay with that. If I perish, I perish. She is a very brave young woman. And verse 17 to finish the chapter, "So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him." So the stage is set. Haman is planning a special day for the Persians to be able to attack the Israelites without consequences. The Jews are all praying. Esther is prepared to go before the king. And this all hinges on Ahasuerus' response, which, as we have established, he's a king more invested in getting drunk and partying than doing anything productive. So who knows how this is going to go down. Thankfully, King Ahasuerus is very accepting of Esther. I fully believe that her becoming queen was because of God's will and because King Ahasuerus really liked her. Not only does he not have her executed for showing up without permission, but he actually gives her fervent permission to enter his throne room and chambers at any time she desires, which as far as I am aware is not something even Haman was allowed to do. She is the queen after all, so it kind of makes sense. Unfortunately, Esther does initially chicken out and merely invites the king to a party she's now throwing on the next day. Although I don't really think we can hold that against her. It's one thing to appear before the king and ask him nicely to not kill you for that. It's never entirely to say, hey, your most trusted advisor and probably best friend is kind of evil and wants to kill us all. That's an entire another step. Just because the king likes her, he's still only known her for a very short period of time compared to how long he's known and trusted Haman. So it makes sense she wants to kind of butter him up before she drops the bomb on him. So she invites him over to a party. They enjoy themselves, and he enjoys himself so much that he offers Esther whatever she wants, up to half the kingdom. I don't know exactly how that works. I would have assumed that the queen was already entitled to that, being married to the king. Perhaps he was offering her to be a regional governor of some kind, or maybe even a general. I'm not familiar enough with Persian culture to really say either way. But Esther instead simply invites him back to another party the next day. And the king says, I was willing to offer you my kingdom, I'm certainly going to accept another party. So he and Haman return, she throws another party, and the king is once again impressed enough that he offers her anything, up to half the kingdom. He's probably expecting her to be the kind of king that he wanted to replace Vashti, who was obviously far too stubborn for his liking. He's probably expecting her to say, I want beautiful gowns, or jewels, or money, or power, or something like that. The last thing he was probably expecting was for her to fall down before him and plead and beg for her life. Has to be a very awkward spin on the party. Let's read it. Chapter 9, verses 13. Then said Esther, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shunai to do tomorrow also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's... Nope, not verse 13, I apologize for that. That's further on in the story. Let's see. Oh, chapter 8, I was in the wrong chapter. Chapter 8, verses... No, not chapter 8. I do apologize for this. I do not have a bookmark in this chapter. Chapter 7, verses 3. Then Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. Not only spare me, but my entire extended family. For we are sold, and I and my people to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. If we were just to be sold into slavery and mistreated like we were back in Egypt, back in the good old days, I would have been quiet. Even if I had known, I could convince the king to use his power to save us. But since we're all going to die, this is a big enough deal for me to ask you directly. There's that spirit of humbleness again. I wouldn't have even bothered you if we weren't literally all going to be murdered. It's a lot more humble than I would have been. Verse 5, then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he, and where is he, that durst presume in his heart to do so? I am the king of Persia. We are the most powerful force on this planet. Tell me who it is so I can smite him. Verse 6, and Esther said, the advisory and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. Yebet? And the king ariseth from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen. I haven't seen this guy so mad since Vashti put on him. Please spare me. For he saw that there was evil determined against him by of the beautiful and humble Esther, pleading and hoping that the queen could somehow spare his life. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed wherein Esther was. Then saith the king, Will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. That didn't work out so well. Apparently, the way Haman was pleading made it appear as if he was attacking the queen. And Ahasuerus was not going to put up with that. So he had him carted off and executed on the very gallows. I wanted to say galleons for some reason. On the very gallows that he had built to execute Mordecai. So Haman is dealt away with. Esther successfully petitions the king to have her people defended. And actually, the Jews improved their standing in Persia through all this mess, as they were allowed to attack all their enemies and steal their stuff, basically. So Israel came out of this most definitely on top. As did Esther, who has now definitely gained favor with the king, and even Mordecai. If we turn to the end of the book, chapter 10, And the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declarations and the greatness of Mordecai, who took Haman's place as second in command of the country, whereunto the king advanced him. Are they not written in the books of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. The end of this story has the man who was plotted against by the very powerful Haman, despite being a very lowly officer, and for the not exactly capital crime of not bowing down and worshiping someone who had no business asking him to bow down and worship him. He eventually takes Haman's place. Queen Esther, as far as we know, lived a long, happy life, probably enjoyed being royalty. I assume most people would. And Mordecai enjoyed being in a position that he could prevent and protect any further damage or attacks that would come upon his people, thus ensuring the Israelites' safety as long as they stayed in Persia, much as Mordecai had originally predicted. I know my people will be saved no matter what you do, Esther. God is bigger than any of his human servants and anyone who would take out his will. The book of Esther, in general, reminds me a lot of the book of Daniel. We have a relatively young-ish Israelite in a very foreign land with very different rules who is constantly in danger from higher-ups who do not think kindly of them. And yet, because more through God than anything else, but also due to their very godly personal character, find favor with the highest authority in their lands, the kings. Daniel was appointed second in command of Persia back when Cyrus was reigning, sometime before King Ahasuerus, and Esther is made queen of her country. Both of them save many of their, kinsmen, I guess I should say, their fellow Jews and Israelites, through being close personal friends with their kings. The wise men, such as Haman, think very poorly of both Daniel and Esther, and they are both, in both eras, attempt to have both of them executed, thrown to lions, and simply murdered, respectively. And in both cases, Daniel and Esther prevail, not through any talents of their own. Both of them, they're a queen and a wise man, respectively. Neither of them are commanding armies. Neither of them have any real political sway or power at their command. And yet they both end up on top. Haman is hung, and the wise men who attempted to have Daniel executed are thrown to the very lions that they had Daniel thrown to. It's clear throughout the Old Testament and the New that God is more powerful than any king, more powerful than any regime or army or any circumstance you could be in. Even if your only recourse is to simply go up and ask the king to spare you, and the simple act of going to him and asking is most likely going to get you executed. Even if that's the kind of situation you're in, even if you've already been thrown to the lions, God is still mightier. He is still more powerful. His angels can shut lions' mouths, and his angels can make sure Haman's mouth doesn't stay shut, which is probably what got him killed in the first place. I'm not going to attempt to find it, as that would take too long, but I believe it is in the book of 1 Timothy that says we are not given a spirit of fear or of weakness, but of power, courage, and a strong heart. Is that the right book?
I'd have to look that up myself.
1st or 2nd Timothy. I memorized the verse, but not the address. And I think those are very true words. In the time and place we live in today, we're not really in danger of being fed to lions or executed by the vice president. But we are nonetheless possessing of the same spirit of strength and of bravery that both Daniel, Esther, Timothy, and a whole lot of other people in this book have been granted with. Among the many other things we are called to be in our Christian lives is to be brave, to be courageous, and stand up and defend what we believe. To defend the church, to defend our God, and He in turn will defend us. He'll protect us and He'll care for us. Pastor?